Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 542, The Heart of Darkness. Fascism is one of those terms that looms large in our conception of history. Outside of a few circles made up primarily of the sort of folks people of sense generally try to avoid, fascism is an ideology that is pretty universally reviled. There are certainly apologists for it. Arguably, the last few years of public discourse have revealed that there are many more than a lot of us had thought, but I do still think it's fair to say that on balance, if a person goes around saying that they are a fascist, it will not do wonders for their social life. Maybe that's just me being aspirational, but I like to think it's true. And yet, despite a, to put it mildly, rather unpopular reputation, fascism as an ideology is remarkably hard to pin down, which presents us with something of a challenge in intellectual terms when we talk about modern history, because from a certain perspective, fascism is kind of central to the creation of the world as it exists today. After all, from a certain perspective, the history of the 20th century is the history of an ideological battle between the three major strands of modern global ideology, with fascism being on the losing side. And yet, if you think of the other two ideologies that dominated the 20th century, communism, or more specifically Marxism-Leninism, and liberalism, they are pretty well defined as systems of thought. What I mean by that is that regardless of what you think of those ideologies in themselves, they represent coherently defined worldviews. If you ask 10 different liberals what liberalism is, you probably won't get completely identical answers, but you'll get similar ones that deal with notions like individual liberty, limited government, the importance of human rights, private property, and the democratic process. Similarly, if you ask 10 different Marxists about their ideology, you'll get something about class struggle, the stages of history, the tension between the proletarian worker and the bourgeois master over control of the means of production. Yet it doesn't tend to work that way with fascists, whose ideology tends to be far less defined, which can make even identifying fascism itself something of a challenge, unless those who hold those views are willing to proudly claim the name, which these days they often are not. Why exactly are we talking about this? Well, because as we discussed in episode 535, the question of whether or not in the lead-up to World War II, Japan could be called a fascist state has been a subject of academic debate more or less since the end of that very conflict. This is a question that is at once deeply academic, after all it's about fitting a definition to a form of government that no longer exists, and also very much not. After all, while Japan's imperial government is a thing of the past, there are still those today who defend it or support its actions, implying, of course, ideological sympathy for its worldview. And of course, while the fascist powers lost World War II, fascism as an ideology is not dead, and looking to examples from the past to see how the ideas manifested then can help us spot fascist ideas when they appear today. Just as a quick aside before we get into it, there is so much to talk about in this episode that I'm not really going to retread much of anything from episode 535 as a refresh. Also, because historical comparison is such a crucial part of this topic, but going over the history of every other major fascist movement in history would take up several episodes, I'm going to assume you have some familiarity with those movements, particularly the basic history of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. Now, this is a very difficult question to answer. On the one hand, there were no parties in Japan that ever openly labeled themselves as fascist or declared themselves as adherents of the principles outlined by Benito Mussolini in Italy or Adolf Hitler in Germany. On the other hand, fascist ideas were pretty clearly circulating publicly, and the government clearly adopted several of those ideas to its own benefit. But before we even get to the question of Japanese fascism, we have to answer a somewhat more fundamental question. What even is fascism in the first place? And almost immediately we're going to run into a lot of trouble here, because as we've already talked about, fascism is not really an intellectually coherent worldview in the same way that Marxism or liberalism can be. Even if you merely look at those who outright claimed the label of fascist or expressed sympathy for fascism during the first half of the 20th century, you get a pretty wild mix of worldviews. You have, of course, the imperialism of men like Benito Mussolini, whose obsession was to remake Italy into a sort of second coming of the Roman Empire through military conquest, but also the isolationist pacifism of the British Union of Fascists and their leader Oswald Mosley. You have the sleek techno-fetishism and paganism of Hitler and the Nazis, who emphasized a type of modernism combined with a distorted and mythologized version of the pre-Christian German past, but also the explicitly Catholic monarchist nationalism of Francisco Franco and the Spanish Phalangists. These sort of contradictions keep coming up the more you look. For example, in Italy, fascism was famously defined in an article ostensibly put together by Mussolini for the Treccani Encyclopedia. In fact, it was written by Giovanni Gentile, one of his toadies. That vision of fascism was heavily philosophical and intellectual, borrowing from the ideas of complex figures like George Hegel, yet one of the major defenders of Mussolini's fascist regime was the anti-intellectual mystic poet Julius Evola. Now, I think you get the general idea here, but that raises the question, how do we define an ideology that is so slippery, particularly once you're trying to engage in any level of cross-national comparison? Now, there is some good news here. On the one hand, academic study of the question, was Imperial Japan a fascist state, has a long history, so there's plenty of material for us to work with. On the other hand, and I'm tipping my own hand a bit as to my views here, I think a lot of that material is not very good. You see, pretty much all the work done on this subject, both in Japan and outside of it, before, during, and in the first few decades after the Second World War, was informed by a definition of fascism that frankly I don't think is very good, the Marxist one. Japanese academia has always had a strong Marxist strain. Indeed, arguably academia was and remains one of the strongest bastions of Marxist thought in the country. There are a lot of complicated reasons why that's the case. The simplest answer is that Marx was very in vogue in the political and social sciences around the time Japan's modern academic system was first coming together, and that the nature of imperial democracy in the early 20th century raised a lot of questions about how societies evolved that Marx seemed to offer compelling answers to. Unfortunately, anything more than that on this particular question is beyond our scope today. Anyway, Japanese academics trying to explain the rise of fascism tended, before the 60s, to really fall into Marxist conceptions of history, which means we now need to explain a bit about the Marxist conception of not only fascism, but all of human history. If you know your Marxist theory, and of course we all do, because what else would we talk about at dinner parties otherwise, you know that Marx divided history into a series of stages defined by ownership of the means of production. In Europe during the Middle Ages, the feudal mode of production was dominated by the nobility, which owned the means of production, the land, but required the labor of peasants to make said land productive. The tension over the labor of peasants and ownership of land defined medieval society. It also gave rise to a new class, the merchant townsman, whose growing wealth trading the produce of the land created contradictions that eventually destroyed feudalism and gave rise to a new order, the capitalist system. In the capitalist system, those same merchants controlled a new means of production, the factory, this time relying on the labor of urban workers to make the factories productive. Of course, eventually, that too would give rise to new contradictions that would lead to the overthrow of capitalism and the advent of socialism and eventually communism. And yes, I'm simplifying a lot here. If you want a lecture on the Marxist stages of history, I'm not the guy to go to. Anyway, where does fascism fit into that worldview? Well, in Japan, it depends on what stage of history that you think Japan is in during the early 20th century. Europe's Marxists believed fascism represented a crisis of what they called late-stage capitalism. As capitalism's problems were growing, fascism as a movement emerged as a stopgap to try and maintain the existing social and economic order. Some Japanese Marxists accepted this explanation because they believed Japan had entered its own capitalist stage of history after the Meiji Restoration. Japan's fascist movement was thus a crisis of capitalism in the same way that Germany's was or Italy's was. Others rejected this worldview, believing that Japan was still partially in the feudal stage because the Meiji system had not really overthrown the old order, but merely modified it. Thus, according to these Marxists, Japan couldn't be fascist because it hadn't really become capitalist yet. They therefore denied that Japan was fascist and tried to modify the definition or use a different phrase. I am simplifying the debate between these two factions pretty heavily because, to be honest, I really don't want to get into it that much. I honestly think the Marxist analysis of fascism really misses the mark. It's kind of pointless, in my view, to argue that fascism props up capitalism. Capitalism is such a powerful force in modern economies that any system that doesn't actively try to crush it will see it prosper. For another, Marxists have never been able to explain why, if fascism is a crisis of capitalism intended to keep things as they are, fascist movements would appeal to people outside of the existing elite. Finally, and probably most damning in my view, all of this focus on the tensions of capitalism means that Marxist explanations of fascism tend to deal only secondarily, if at all, with fascist racism and territorial expansionism, and frankly, it's pretty ridiculous to argue that, say, the Holocaust or the mass extermination of the mentally ill and disabled in Nazi Germany can be explained as a defense of capitalism. It wasn't really until the 60s when a Japanese academic moved away from this Marxist framework in discussing fascism. His name was Maruyama Masao, and he's probably one of the single most famous figures in post-war academia in Japan. Maruyama is a really interesting figure, and he has a lot of importance in the history of Japanese political thought. I might do a whole episode on him one day. Honestly, the main reason I haven't yet is that I know some people who specialized in his work, and I'm holding on to hope that some of them will be willing to do a guest spot at some point. To give you the short version, Maruyama Masao was born in Osaka in 1914, the son of a liberal journalist named Maruyama Kanji. He was also a talented student from a young age, eventually earning a spot at the nation's most prestigious school, Tokyo Imperial University, which of course has since dropped the Imperial from its name. Maruyama got his undergraduate degree in 1937, and his thesis, The Concept of the Nation-State in Political Science, was good enough to get him immediate admission to the graduate program and a spot as an assistant professor. He would remain at the University of Tokyo until his retirement in 1971, minus a brief stint in 1945 when he was drafted at the tail end of World War II into the army. Maruyama was actually in uniform and present at Hiroshima on August 6th, and his experience there would pretty profoundly shape his life going forward. After his demobilization in 1946, Maruyama would turn his attention to Japanese politics and become deeply involved in the Japanese political left. He was actually one of the big backers of the 1960 anti-security treaty protests, among other things. Intellectually, however, he's best remembered for his work on the pre-1945 political order, starting in 1946 with his essay The Logic and Philosophy of Ultranationalism, and continuing pretty much through the rest of his career. Maruyama's conception of Japanese fascism is complicated, given that he developed it over the course of 25 plus years of academic work. To try and make it as straightforward as possible, he argued that Japan's political modernization was fundamentally incomplete. The overthrow of feudalism in 1868 had of course not ushered in a complete democratic capitalist order, and in the intellectual world, Japanese rationalism, championed by the Tokugawa-era thinker Ogyū Sorai, and later Meiji men like Fukuzawa Yukichi, had never been able to beat back a strain of irrationalist romanticism that had roots in the old Kokugaku scholarship and its emphasis on Japan's uniqueness as the land of the gods. Hang on to those two terms, rationalism and romanticism. We're going to come back to them in a bit. As a result, Japan's masses were not completely politically engaged in the way those of Europe and America were, and so fascism could not come from below, from a groundswell of popular support, the way it had in Germany or Italy. Fascism had to be imposed from above. Specifically, Maruyama identified 3 phases of Japanese fascism, and I'm going to quote here from Federico Marcone's excellent work on the debates around Japanese fascism. Quote, "An initial preparatory phase between the end of the First World War and the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 saw the emergence of an array of right-wing movements among civilians. A second phase, that of maturity, spanning to the 26 February 1936 incident, saw those civilian movements becoming, quote, concretely linked to a segment of military power, unquote," he's quoting Maruyama there, "which became the driving force of the fascist movement, gradually coming to occupy the core of the national government. The third phase, that of the consummation period, was the actual period of Japanese fascism that lasted until the end of the war on 15th August 1945. During the period of actual fascism, I guess we'll call it, Maruyama describes the military as imposing fascism upon society with the help of the bureaucracy and sympathetic members of the emperor's inner circle, as well as big business and sympathetic politicians. The different circumstances of the emergence of Japanese fascism led, in Maruyama's view, to a different political system from what you saw in other fascist powers. On the one hand, Japanese fascists did share, in his estimation, many of the views of their European counterparts: a rejection of liberal individualism and democracy, extreme hostility to Marxism and socialism, a tendency to glorify the military, warfare, and expansionism, and a strong emphasis on racial mythology and some mystic notion of national essence. On the other hand, he argued that Japanese fascism had several characteristics all its own, most notably the emphasis on the family system as a kind of mini-state, with a classically Confucian connection drawn between reverence for family and reverence for the government, as well as an emphasis on the countryside as a bastion of traditional values. As an aside here, I do think Maruyama's missing the mark a bit on this particular one. That idea of the countryside being a bastion of traditional values is also very prevalent in Nazi propaganda. However, the propaganda of Pan-Asianism was definitely unique to Japan. Even if it was totally self-serving, no other fascist state that I'm aware of was going around casting its actions in an anti-imperialist light. Maruyama's analysis was very much bound up in his politics. For him, understanding fascism was essential to counteracting what he saw as a system of irresponsibility that was endemic to Japanese politics. Only by rejecting that irresponsibility and engaging with political active citizenship, and by grappling with the mistakes of the past, could post-war Japan build a truly functional democracy that could resist any tendency to backslide. Maruyama's analysis has been, for lack of a better term, genre-defining. It is still a framework people use today, and indeed sharp-eared listeners will recall I myself made use of his language about fascism from above versus fascism from below. Not everyone accepts Maruyama's framework, of course. In particular, many English-language historians of Japan did not, at first, use the term fascism to describe the nation's wartime system. Federico Marcone ties this to a Cold War period desire to prove that Japanese society wasn't inherently authoritarian, but had strong democratic tendencies, and thus was capable of resisting communism. For example, John Halliday argued that there was no clear transition moment for Japan's fascist movements, no March on Rome, no Reichstag fire or enabling act to mark the point where Japan became fascist, and that at any rate, for those who were fascists, the existence of the emperor system put real limits on their party's absolute power that did not exist in Mussolini's Italy, where the king had a lot less sway, or Hitler's Germany. Halliday also noted, not unreasonably, that while the army had a crucial role in politics during the war years, that wasn't exactly unique. Indeed, the army had held a lot of political power going all the way back to the Meiji era. Similarly, Gregory Kashza argued that Japan's lack of a single-party dictatorship or a functional one-party system, the Imperial Rule Assistance Association never quite reached that level, and that its fascists were not propelled into power by a movement from below but were part of an existing elite, meant it was more apt to say military bureaucratic politics instead of fascism, a term which he viewed at any rate as being overused by Marxists to the point of losing all meaning. Ben-Ami Shilani argued something similar in his work. Terms like fascist or totalitarian in the Japanese context, quote, are meaningful only if understood in their broadest and pejorative sense, as nicknames for highlighting the repressive and aggressive character of the state. The lack of an official fixed-party dogma or omniscient truth-interpreting leader, a role the emperor, given his minimal public role beyond symbolism, couldn't fill, meant the label didn't fit. At any rate, the regime, while oppressive and extremely violent, was never systemic about that violence in the way the Nazis were with their exterminationist rhetoric and their powerful police state. This is pretty much the state of the academic back and forth down to today. Generally, analysis of Japanese fascism tends to start from Maruyama's perspective, a fully Marxist one, or from one of these various critiques of those positions. But that doesn't give us an answer. Can we call Japan's wartime system fascist? What even is fascism in the first place? Well, this is where we have to go back to the beginning and start by trying to define fascism again, and it's also where we're entering the realm of what are, just to be upfront, my opinions, which, naturally enough, I do think I can justify pretty well, but which are just that. As always, I encourage you not to just accept what I say, but to think for yourself. I have put some time and energy into those questions, but that doesn't automatically make my interpretation the best one or an authoritative one. With that said, when I teach the history of fascism, there are two different interpretations I personally like to work with. The first is from Kevin Passmore, whose work, Fascism: A Very Short Introduction, is both actually very short, the whole Very Short Introduction series is excellent and I recommend it really highly, and a great academic work for understanding the ideology. Passmore writes very approachably on this subject and I think does a good job of highlighting some of the issues with the historiographical approach that we just talked about. Quote, the diverse origins of those who became fascists underlines once again the contradictory nature of fascism and reminds us that fascists disagreed among themselves about the very essence of their movement. Some placed more emphasis on fascism's radical aspects, others on its conservative side. A few embraced only the radical or reactionary sides, but from our point of view, they ceased to be properly fascist, whatever they claimed. There were also disagreements about the nature of fascism's radicalism. Some saw it as residing in its corporatist approach to labor relations, while others believed corporatism undermined the primacy of the national interest. A minority saw fascism as an opportunity to advance the cause of women, while the majority saw fascism as a sort of manly revolution. Further disputes were caused by fascism's relationship with conservatism. Given fascists' desire to restore order and destroy the left, it was always likely to attract support from authoritarian conservatives, yet fascists also wanted to supplant conservatives as the embodiment of the nation. To rephrase that in simpler terms, there's no consistent fascist worldview among fascists themselves who often disagreed across movements and within their own movements about what they even believed. You see that pretty clearly in the history of Japanese fascism too. The contradictory emphasis on Japanese empire versus liberatory Pan-Asianism, on economic self-sufficiency for bureaucrats versus endless expansionary war on the continent for militarists, which did end up eating up all those resources that were supposed to go into creating the self-sufficient infrastructure. This complicated interweaving of ideas is a reflection, says Passmore, of the specific contexts and concerns of the early 20th century when fascism first coalesced as an idea, an age where women's rights and workers' rights and voting rights were all expanding, leading to a sense among conservatives that the traditional order of society was being threatened. It's also symbolic of the fact that fascism itself arose in different contexts, from the civil war in Spain to the class conflicts of Italy, and from many different political and intellectual contexts as well. Fascist movements could draw from the political right by claiming to be defenders of the traditional order, but also the left by tapping into left-wing hostility towards the political and economic establishment, or the notion that conventional left-wing parties have betrayed the interests of the people. For example, as Passmore notes, by claiming those conventional left-wing parties are too concerned with minorities or the demands of feminists rather than real citizens. Indeed, Passmore points out, correctly I think, that while traditional conservatives, largely in Europe members of the old aristocracy, who were opposed to the loss of their traditional privileges and abhorred the mob rule of mass voting rights, did work with fascists, this was an alliance of convenience. Those conservatives knew they lacked the raw numbers to win at the ballot box in these new conditions, and hoped to rope fascist believers into an alliance that would allow them to control the mob passions of the fascist movements to their own ends. Thus, fascism couldn't exist, says Passmore, without democracy. It was democracy that made it necessary to radicalize the people into support of extreme fascist nationalism in the first place. The only consistent unifying ideology Passmore notes across fascist movements is that of opposition, specifically to liberalism, which prioritizes the selfish needs of the individual, feminism, emphasizing gender, socialism and Marxism, emphasizing class, and more broadly to Enlightenment rationalism, with its emphasis on the power of reason and the fundamental equality of humans. All of these, for fascists, miss the real value of the nation, which is bound together by a romanticized idea of community and heroism based in, from an intellectual point of view, a mythologized reading of the nation's history. After noting all of this, Passmore ventures his own definition of fascism, which, again, I think is pretty good. Quote, "Fascism is a set of ideologies and practices that seeks to place the nation, defined in exclusive biological, cultural, and/or historical terms, above all other sources of loyalty, and to create a mobilized national community. Fascist nationalism is reactionary in that it entails an implacable hostility to socialism and feminism, for they are seen as prioritizing class or gender rather than nation. This is why fascism is a movement of the extreme right. Fascism is also a movement of the radical right because the defeat of socialism and feminism and the creation of the mobilized nation are held to depend upon the advent to power of a new elite acting in the name of the people, headed by a charismatic leader and embodied in a mass militarized party. Fascists are pushed towards conservatism by a common hatred of socialism and feminism, but are prepared to override conservative interests, family, property, religion, where the interests of the nation are considered to require it. Fascist radicalism also derives from a desire to assuage discontent by accepting specific demands of the labor and women's movements, so long as those demands accord with the national priority. Fascists seek to ensure the harmonization of workers' and women's interests with those of the nation by mobilizing them within special sections of the party or within a corporate system. Access to these organizations and the benefits they confer upon members depends on the individual's national, political, and/or racial characteristics. All aspects of fascist policy are suffused with ultranationalism. I think this does a great job of keying in on the ways in which the fascist worldview operates, but I also think it can be a bit abstract, and Passmore does tend to ground everything in European history. That can be useful. You'll never hear me saying more historical context is bad, but since we're trying to talk about fascism in a non-European context, it can be a bit misleading. And so there's one other definition I like to make use of when we talk about fascist ideology, one of my favorite essays by the Italian writer Umberto Eco, called Fascism. For Eco, fascism was a very personal topic. He grew up under Mussolini's rule in Italy and begins the essay with a recollection of an essay contest he'd been made to enter as a young man. The prompt, he recalled, was, quote, "Should we die for the glory of Mussolini and the immortal destiny of Italy?" My answer was positive. I was a smart boy. Eco wrote the essay 50 years later during the 1990s, but still felt that understanding fascism was a pressing issue. Looking to the rise of far-right parties in Europe, Eco stated the threat of fascism was not in the past. Quote, "Fascism is still around us, sometimes in plainclothes. It would be so much easier for us if there appeared on the world scene somebody saying, 'I want to reopen Auschwitz, I want the black shirts to parade again in the Italian squares.' Life is not that simple. Fascism can come back under the most innocent of disguises. Our duty is to uncover it and to point our finger at any of its new instances every day in every part of the world. And yet, calling fascism what it is can be a very challenging exercise given what we've already talked about. It's not a fixed ideology. To deal with this, Eco suggests a series of characteristics he calls fascism, the prefix meaning something like earliest or original derived from Greek. All of these characteristics, he says, derive from fascists' anti-rational worldview, from a rejection of the values of the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on human reason and fundamental human equality. Fascism was instead an outgrowth of anti-Enlightenment Romanticism, a complicated intellectual movement that was, in essence, pushing back against those values in favor of a heroic, nationalist worldview driven by forceful emotive responses rather than contemplative reason. Now, if you've never read Umberto Eco, the man can be dense, let's call it, so I'm not going to read off all 14 characteristics he identified because that would be an episode by itself. Instead, I'm going to do my best to summarize them and link to the original essay in the show notes. Unfortunately, you do need a subscription to the New York Review of Books to read it. Your local library might have a copy, or you might have some luck finding another copy online. Anyway, the 14 characteristics are, first, the cult of tradition, a belief in some sort of mythologized golden past. That golden age would be loosely constructed on actual history, the Roman Empire for Italian fascists, the golden age of church and monarchy for Spanish ones. But the fascist vision of that golden past was always romanticized, not based on a real, complex view of the historical period at play. 2. A focus on traditionalism and the rejection of modernism. Modernism in this context doesn't mean modern technology, but a certain way of viewing the world. Again, liberalism, rationalism, their various related ideologies. Instead, quote, the rejection of the modern world was disguised as a rebuttal of the capitalistic way of life, but it was mainly concerned with the rejection of the spirit of 1789 and 1776, of course. Those are, by the way, the years of the French and American Revolutions. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. These are the ideas, according to fascists, holding the nation back from a return to that glorious past. Third, the irrationalist worldview prizes action above thinking. Thought, in fact, is unmasculine and weak. Number 4, disagreement in critical thought is treasonous because none of this worldview can stand up to critical analysis or engagement. Number 5, the use of human fear of difference of the outsider or invader to create a sense of threat. Basically playing on human fears of invasion to shut down critical reasoning. 6, an appeal to a frustrated social class, usually the middle class, as members of this class feel either politically humiliated or squeezed by social or economic circumstances, they will be more open to extreme ideologies. 7, an obsession with some kind of conspiracy or plot that heightens the sense of threat to the nation and justifies an extreme response. 8, a shifting rhetoric between the enemy is too strong and too weak. To encourage the sense of grievance and humiliation that justifies their actions, fascists must position their enemies as overwhelming. But the enemy must also be weak and beatable because otherwise, what's the point of fighting them? 9. The notion that pacifism itself is weakness and life is permanent warfare. Life is built on heroic struggle, also implying that said struggle is without end. 10. A contempt for any sign of weakness, particularly for those outside the nation, but also anyone in the nation who is beneath or below you, for example, a subordinate in the military or in the party. 11. A cult of heroism and the embrace of death. Fascism's romantic appeal relies on the notion that anyone and everyone can be educated to be a hero for the nation, and that their ultimate value is dying heroically for the national cause. 12. A focus on machismo and masculinity as the ultimate source of power. 13. Selective populism. The people have a common will, but democracy is a corrupt system and not useful for discovering said will. Only the party and its leader knows the will of the masses. 14th and finally, newspeak, a term derived from George Orwell. Fascist language makes use of simple rhetoric and syntax because without complicated language, it's hard to formulate complicated ideas, and it's only those complicated ideas that let you break through the ideological wall. Echo notes that not all of these characteristics have to be in a system to call the system fascist, but the more of them you see in a society, the more fash-ish, so to speak, that society has become, the closer it is to the fascist event horizon. Now, these are the definitions I use when I teach fascism, so how do they differ from the other approaches we've outlined, and how does Imperial Japan fit those definitions? Well, for a start, I think it's pretty clear the old Marxist definition of fascism as a crisis of capitalism doesn't offer or add much in comparison to either Passmore or Echo. In general, I'm pretty skeptical of Marxist historical theory, just to be upfront about it, so take that for what it's worth. I also think that my preferred definitions point to a problem with all of those objections raised by those English language academics as to why Japan can't be labeled fascist. Most of those objections have to do with how the imperial system rose or its structure, the lack of a Rubicon moment that brings the fascists to power, the incompleteness or the structural weakness of the military state, that sort of thing. But you'll notice none of those qualifications are in either Passmore or Echo's definition. I don't think it's productive to look at fascism that way at all. Fascism is not a recipe for how to govern or how to seize power, it is a mindset, an emotional way of reacting to the complexities of the modern world by lashing out against it. In my view, that's what sets fascism apart from liberalism and Marxism. Those are theories grounded in Enlightenment rationalism, whatever you might think of their conclusions. Fascism is the anti-theory. As Echo points out, in many ways it is anti-thought. It is entirely about the desire to reject thinking and instead embrace this emotional worldview of we are the heroes. Maruyama's theory, I think, holds up better, though his whole notion of incomplete modernization and the culture of irresponsibility is, I think, wrapped up in this idea that Japan's modern history is fundamentally unique, which it is in some ways, but frankly, the whole incompleteness of modernization thing strikes me as impossible to prove. What is complete modernization? How would you judge Japan's versus anyone else's? And maybe this is just some post-COVID lockdown cynicism, but I do think most prosperous countries have a culture of irresponsibility to some extent. Ultimately, my view is that while the structure of Imperial Japan was a mess, as we've covered, the nature of the emperor system plus the rules of the constitution meant nobody was really at the helm of the whole damn operation anyway. Enough elements of the mindset laid out by Passmore and Echo are present in Imperial Japan for the label to fit. The reactionary hatred of liberalism and socialism, the emphasis on the nation as the most important way to understand history, the emphasis on national mobilization to face a crisis. Basically all of Passmore's criteria are already readily apparent in wartime Japan. And frankly, I think you can go down basically all of Echo's points and see them too. There are a few that are harder to apply, such as the idea of an enemy conspiracy. Unlike the Nazis, the Japanese government didn't have a long history of anti-Jewish conspiracy to dig into to support its worldview. But the notion that Japan was encircled by hostile powers jealous of its success, the so-called ABCD encirclement, American, British, Chinese, Dutch, that so many military leaders pointed to, did fill a similar role. So too, frankly, did the fear of communist infiltration, which remained a serious governmental concern even as most of the Communist Party leadership was rotting away in jail. Similarly, the 13th point is complicated. Hitler and Mussolini certainly claimed to be acting on the true will of their respective peoples, but nobody would have claimed the emperor's actions, or the government in general, reflected popular sentiment. It was the other way around. The popular will was supposed to attune itself to the desire of the emperor. But certainly the notion that the emperor's connections to the gods and the people's connection to the emperor were more authentic than any democratic government was a part of state propaganda. Now, we're already close to the 40-minute mark, and I don't want to go through all 14 points, but I think if you're familiar with this period, if you re-listen to episode 535, it's pretty hard to argue that most of them don't apply. And really, this is the important part of the discussion. The core of my argument here is that fascism is a mindset, a way of viewing the world through a lens of anger and conspiracy. That, in turn, is what lets us spot it in the modern world. If you want to spot a fascist movement today, look for that reaction of rejection, that embrace of an emotional response rather than a rational one. And that relevance for today, in turn, is precisely what makes the exercise of looking backwards worthwhile. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who've given at our shout-out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japanesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fisheye Catch Our Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time, because I am taking next week off to start my new job, for the first part of a series on daily life in Meiji Japan.